It was just a portrait of two sisters, but look more closely at the space between them. Dr. Miriam Vance had spent 23 years working in the archive of the Pacific Northwest Historical Society in Seattle, and in that time she believed she had developed an immunity to surprise. Her domain was the careful, dust-laden cataloging of the region's visual past, the logging camps, the fledgling city streets, the stoic pioneer families posed before their raw timber homesteads. The photography of the Pacific Northwest in its formative years was like the landscape itself, often harsh, unadorned, and spoke more of struggle than of grace, which was why the donation from the estate of a retired Boeing engineer named Arthur Finch in the autumn of 2017 initially seemed like more of the same. Several unremarkable boxes of family papers, a handful of daguerreotypes in velvet cases, and a crumbling album filled with cartes de visite. It was during her final inventory pass, her back aching from a long afternoon of bending over acid-free storage trays, that she noticed the loose plate. It had slid between the stiff pages of a ledger documenting the purchase of shipbuilding timber, a ledger that bore the stamped insignia of the Finch and McAllister Millworks, Port Gamble, Washington Territory, 1888-1895. The plate itself was a standard 5x 7-inch dry glass negative, but it was housed in a custom-made folding case of tooled leather, worn soft as velvet from handling. A small brass plaque on the case's front was engraved with a single cryptic word, Scylla. Miriam extracted the case with a curator's gentle precision, laying it on the clean white blotter of her examination table. The afternoon light, filtered through the high, grimy windows of the archive's reading room, caught the brass and made it wink. She unhooked the delicate clasp. Inside, nestled in fitted slots lined with faded blue silk, was the negative. She did not need a light table. Even in the dim room, the image was startlingly clear. She lifted it, holding it against the grayish light from the window, and her breath caught in a way it hadn't in a decade. Two young women, perhaps 18 and 20, sat side by side on an ornate wrought iron bench. They were dressed not in the practical woolens and gingham of frontier women, but in gowns of astonishing elegance. The older sister wore a dress of what appeared to be ivory silk, with leg of mutton sleeves and a high, lace-edged collar, the fabric pooling around her in luxurious folds on the bench. The younger sister wore a dress of a deep, rich velvet, its color translating in the negative to a profound black, trimmed with what looked like jet beading. Their hair was styled in elaborate, Gibson Girl-inspired coiffures, intricate waves and braids that spoke of hours of careful labor. They were, by any conventional measure, stunningly beautiful, but it was not their beauty that held Miriam. It was their posture and the setting. They were not touching. They sat with a precise, almost geometric distance between them on the bench, their backs rod straight, their hands folded identically in their laps. Their faces were turned toward the camera, but their expressions were not serene. They were masks of profound, crystalline stillness. Not the stillness of patience, but of suspension. Behind them was not a painted studio backdrop of a garden or parlor, but a real location, slightly out of focus, the dense, dark wall of a Pacific Northwest old-growth forest. Massive, furrowed trunks of Douglas fir and western red cedar rose like cathedral columns into a mist-obscured canopy. The wrought iron bench, an artifact of cultivated European style, looked absurdly fragile, almost impertinent against that primordial green gloom. The caption, etched with a fine needle directly into the emulsion along the bottom border, read, Lena and Cora, October 1915, .no. That was a lighthouse station on the northern tip of the Kitsap Peninsula, a remote, wind-scoured place of shifting sands and dense coastal forest. It was not a place for silk gowns and velvet. The dissonance was absolute. Miriam felt a familiar, scholarly itch, the itch of a narrative that didn't cohere. She carried the plate to the digital lab, her mind already racing through possibilities. A theatrical production, a wealthy family's eccentric outing, but the date, 1915, gnawed at her. America was on the cusp of war. The Pacific Northwest was a region of hardscrabble mills, fishing fleets, and booming, rough-edged cities. This image felt like a ghost, a fragment of a world that shouldn't have existed there and then. Under the high-resolution scanner, the negative yielded more secrets. The detail was exquisite. Miriam could see the individual stitches on the lace of the older sister's collar, the subtle nap of the younger sister's velvet, the complex braiding of their hair. She could also see the faint, telltale signs of the photograph's truth. The subjects were slightly too sharp against the softly blurred background. This was not a single exposure. This was a double exposure, or more likely, a composite print. The sisters had been photographed in a studio, against a plain backdrop, and their images had been carefully cut out and superimposed onto a separate photograph of the forest. The work was masterful, nearly seamless to the naked eye, but the digital scan revealed the faintest halo of contrast at the edges of their forms, a microscopic line where art met artifice. Who, in 1915, in the Pacific Northwest, possessed the skill and the motivation to create such an elaborate photographic fiction? And why place these exquisitely dressed women in that specific, forbidding wilderness? Miriam began with the obvious, the donor. Arthur Finch was deceased, but his obituary was easy to find. A lifelong bachelor, a quiet man who had worked as an aerodynamicist. He was the grandson of Alastair Finch, co-founder of the Finch and McAllister Millworks. The Millworks ledger the plate was found and suggested a family connection. She dug into the Finch family history. Alastair Finch had emigrated from Scotland in the 1880s, made a fortune in timber, and died in 1920. Had one son, Douglas, who inherited the business but sold it after the Great Depression and moved to California. Douglas had one child, Arthur, the Boeing engineer. There was no mention in any family tree, newspaper article, or local history of two sisters named Lena and Cora in the Finch lineage. Next, she tackled the location. Point No Point Lighthouse, established in 1879, had a series of keepers and their families. She requested the National Archives records for the station. The keeper from 1912 to 1923 was a man named Thomas H. Warren. His logs, meticulously digitized, were a litany of weather, ship sightings, and maintenance. There was no entry about photographers, nor about visiting society women in fine gowns, but in the log for October 17, 1915, Warren had written, "Fog persists. Schooner Orion reported passing south at 3 p.m. delivered supplies from Port Gamble. Mr. A delivered special parcel, accepted per previous arrangement." The notation was uncharacteristically vague. Mr. A, who was Mr. A, and what was the special parcel? Miriam's attention returned to the plate's leather case and its engraved word, Scylla. In mythology, Scylla was a sea monster, a multi-headed beast that dwelt in a narrow strait opposite the whirlpool Charybdis. Between Scylla and Charybdis, meant to be caught between two equally perilous alternatives. A strange name for a photograph case. Was it a title, a code, a warning? She expanded her search, moving beyond the Finch family to the wider social and economic network of Port Gamble in the 1910s. Port Gamble was a company town, owned and operated by the Pope and Talbot Lumber Company. It was a tightly controlled, paternalistic community, famously recruiting skilled millworkers from New England and the Midwest to create a pocket of New England charm on the Pacific frontier. It had a reputation for order, piety, and strict social codes. She combed through digitized issues of the Port Gamble Bugle, the company newspaper. The society pages were full of church socials, mill efficiency awards, and notices of births and marriages. Then in the October 22, 1915 edition, a small, boxed notice on page 3 stopped her cold. It was not in the society section, but among the general announcements. Missing. 2 female residents of the Port Gamble community, the sisters Lena and Cora Havelock, were reported absent from their residence on October 15. They were last seen walking in the direction of the waterfront. Lena, 20, is described as 55, slender, with auburn hair. Cora, 18, is 54, of sturdier build, with dark brown hair. Both are considered to be of delicate mental disposition. Any information regarding their whereabouts should be communicated to the Port Gamble constable or to Mr. Alastair Finch at the Millworks office. A reward for information is offered. The hair colors match the negative, the older sister's lighter, the younger's darker. The names match the caption. Lena and Cora Havelock, and Alastair Finch was involved. But delicate mental disposition, that was a common, genteel euphemism of the era for everything from melancholia to what we would now call clinical depression or severe anxiety, and they were missing. Reported missing on October 15, 1915. The photograph was dated October 1915, point no point. Was this a photograph taken after their disappearance, a memorial image? But that made no sense with the studio-quality compositing and the extravagant gowns. Miriam now searched for Havelock in Port Gamble records. She found a census entry for 1910. Walter Havelock, 45, occupation foreman planing mill, born in Maine. Wife Eleanor, 42, born in New York. Daughters Lena, 15, and Cora, 13. They lived in a company house on Cedar Street. By the 1920 census, Walter and Eleanor Havelock were still in Port Gamble, but the daughters were gone. No marriage records. No death certificates in Kitsap County for either girl in that time period. They had simply vanished from the official record after 1915. The connection to Alastair Finch deepened. She found a contract in the Millworks files. In 1913, Walter Havelock had signed a revised employment agreement that included a clause granting the company exclusive rights to any novel mechanical design or process innovation conceived by the employee during the term of his employment, in perpetuity. It was a standard intellectual property clause for the time, brutally favoring the company. But why would a planing mill foreman be innovating mechanical designs? She looked for patents filed under Walter Havelock's name. Nothing. Under Finch and McAllister, nothing relevant. Frustrated, Miriam turned to the photographic technique itself. Who in the region could have done this work? She consulted a colleague specializing in the history of West Coast photography. Composite printing of that quality in 1915 is rare but not unheard of, he told her. It was used for spirit photography, for fantasy scenes, sometimes for advertising. There was a studio in Seattle, run by a German immigrant named Gerhard Hoffmann, that was known for it. He did a lot of work for the wealthy, whimsical portraits, allegorical scenes. He was also a technical perfectionist. Gerhard Hoffmann's studio records were housed at the University of Washington. Miriam spent a day there. Hoffmann's ledgers were meticulous. He listed clients, dates, subjects, and fees. On October 10, 1915, an entry read, Finch, A. Port Gamble. 2 female subjects, studio sitting, full formal. Special request, isolation against neutral. Fee, $75, including materials and secrecy clause. Secrecy clause, that was extraordinary. Then a second entry on October 20, 1915. Finch, A. Port Gamble. Composite printing per provided landscape plate. Advanced masking and etching. Delivery of final negative and custom case. Fee, $150. Final. The timeline was chilling. The studio sitting was on October 10. The sisters were reported missing on October 15. The composite printing was done on October 20. The provided landscape plate was the forest scene. Alastair Finch had commissioned a studio portrait of the Havelock sisters, then after their disappearance had it composited onto a forest background and delivered to the lighthouse keeper at Point No Point, the special parcel, on October 17. This was not a memorial, this was a construction. A deliberate, expensive, and secretive fabrication. But why? What was the purpose of creating this beautiful, haunting, and utterly false image of 2 missing girls in the wilderness? Miriam now focused on Alastair Finch himself. Beyond the milliner, who was he? She found he was a patron of the arts in Seattle, a trustee of the fledgling Seattle Symphony. He had a wife, Margaret, and 3 sons. He was a pillar. But in the correspondence files of the Pope and Talbot headquarters, she found a different thread. Letters between Alastair Finch and the company's Eastern directors, dating to late 1914 and early 1915, expressed growing anxiety. The old-growth reserves near the Sound are nearly depleted, Finch wrote in one. Extraction costs are rising. The future is in second growth management, but that requires capital and patience. The investors lack the latter. They want one last major harvest from the remaining intact tracts to finance the transition. One such tract was a pristine, old-growth forest bordering Point No Point, owned not by Pope and Talbot, but by a patchwork of smallholders and a few families who had homesteaded there in the 1870s. One of those homesteads, according to a land map from 1905, was listed under W. Havelock. Walter Havelock, the foreman, owned land. Property record search confirmed it. In 1890, Walter Havelock's father, a fisherman, had homesteaded a 40-acre parcel of forest on the bluffs above Point No Point. When he died, it passed to Walter. It was not valuable farmland, it was dense coastal forest. But by 1915, with old-growth timber becoming scarce, its value to a milliner like Finch would have been significant. Walter Havelock, however, according to several neighbors' letters in a local history collection, was stubbornly sentimental about the land. He refused to sell it to the mill company, calling it his girl's inheritance and a place of peace. The company had tried to buy it for years, but he wouldn't budge. Then, in the summer of 1915, something changed. A series of letters from the Port Gamble physician, Dr. James P. Moody, to the mill company's infirmary fund, mentioned the Havelock girls with increasing concern. The elder Lena suffers from a nervous exhaustion bordering on catalepsy, brought on, I believe, by the stifling atmosphere of this place and an unfortunate romantic attachment that cannot proceed. The younger, Cora, exhibits a sympathetic hysteria, mirroring her sister's afflictions. I have recommended mountain air, a change of scene, but the family lacks the means. The unfortunate romantic attachment was hinted at in a gossipy letter from the minister's wife. Lena Havelock was often seen in deep conversation with young Douglas Finch, Alastair's eldest son, last summer. Of course, nothing could come of it. Mr. Finch would never allow it. The poor girl took it very hard. She hasn't been the same since. The pieces were assembling into a dark mosaic. Walter Havelock, a stubborn foreman, owned valuable timberland he wouldn't sell. His daughter was emotionally entangled with the mill owner's son, a socially impossible match. Both daughters were emotionally vulnerable, diagnosed with nervous conditions. Then they vanish. Immediately after their disappearance, their father signs over his land. Miriam located the deed transfer in the county records. Dated October 25, 1915, Walter and Eleanor Havelock sold their 40-acre Point No Point homestead to Finch and McAllister Millworks for the sum of $1. The nominal fee was a legal fiction. The real transaction was elsewhere. A notation on the deed in the county recorder's hand said, "Consideration, settlement of all matters pertaining to the welfare of the grantors issue." The welfare of the grantors issue, their children, Lena and Cora. The land was sold for $1 in exchange for the company for Alastair Finch handling the matter of the missing sisters. But what was the matter? Where were they? Miriam now had a hypothesis so terrible she could barely articulate it to herself. She went back to the photograph. She stared at the sisters' faces, at their forced, static beauty, at the terrible, beautiful lie of the composite. They were not in that forest. They had never been in that forest, not in those gowns. The image was a fantasy, a cover story, a beautiful alibi. Scylla, the sea monster. The peril one chooses to avoid a worse one. What was the worst peril? The truth of what actually happened to them. She began searching for records of institutions, asylums, sanatoriums. The delicate mental disposition provided a legal pretext for commitment. She searched Washington and Oregon state asylum records from 1915 onward. She found nothing under Havelock. But in the records of the Western Washington Hospital for the Insane at Steilacoom, she found an intake register entry for October 30, 1915 that made her blood run cold. It listed 2 female patients, admitted together under the names Jane Doe 1 and Jane Doe 2. The physical descriptions matched Lena and Cora perfectly. The admitting physician was Dr. James P. Moody, the Port Gamble doctor. The box for legal authority was checked, and in the margin was written, "Committed per request of A. Finch, Port Gamble, with consent of parents for custodial care and treatment. Patients are non-responsive, identities in question due to trauma. They had been committed under false names, their real identities erased, by arrangement between Alastair Finch, the company doctor, and their parents. The trauma was unspecified. The consent of parents had been purchased for $1 and the deed to 40 acres of timber. But why the photograph? Why the elaborate, beautiful, fake portrait in the woods? Miriam found her answer in the Seattle Society pages of November 1915. Brief notice: Mr. and Mrs. Alastair Finch of Port Gamble regret to announce the postponement of the upcoming marriage of their son, Mr. Douglas Finch, to Miss Eleanor Shipley of San Francisco, due to a period of family mourning following a tragic accident. No details of the accident were given. But a week later, a small item appeared in the Port Gamble Bugle. The community extends its deepest sympathies to the Havelock family. It is now believed that the missing Havelock sisters, in a state of profound despondency, may have wandered into the woods near Point No Point and met with misadventure. Searches of the dense forest have been unsuccessful. They are presumed lost. The photograph was the visual evidence of that presumption. It was not meant to be publicly displayed in 1915. It was a private artifact, a manufactured truth for a specific, small audience. Miriam imagined it. Alastair Finch, having quietly committed the girls to an asylum to remove the social obstacle of his son's entanglement, and to break the father's will over the timberland, needed a story. A story that would explain their permanent absence without the scandal of insanity in the family or the brutality of forced commitment. A tragic, romantic story of 2 beautiful, heartbroken sisters, so delicate, who wandered into the majestic, unforgiving forest and vanished. The composite photograph, delivered to the lighthouse keeper, perhaps as a bribe or to establish a false sighting, was the cornerstone of that story. It created a permanent, documented image of them in the location where they were supposed to be lost. It was proof that could be whispered about, hinted at. I even have a photograph of them there just before such a tragedy. The leather case labeled Scylla was Finch's own private joke, or his acknowledgement of the monstrous choice: destroy 2 lives or let his son's future and a valuable timber harvest be jeopardized. He had chosen to steer his ship towards Scylla. What became of Lena and Cora? Miriam tracked the asylum records. Jane Doe 1 died in the influenza pandemic of 1918. The record listed chronic melancholy as a contributing factor. Jane Doe 2 was discharged in 1922 to the care of family, but the family listed was a false address in Portland. She vanished from all records. Walter and Eleanor Havelock left Port Gamble in 1916, using a small relocation assistance payment from the millworks. They moved to Spokane, where Walter worked in a smaller mill until his death. They never spoke of their daughters again in any document that survived. The photograph, this beautiful, haunting lie, was the only physical remnant of Lena and Cora Havelock that matched the tragic, elegant story concocted to erase them. The truth of institutionalization, of a love affair used as leverage, of a father's land and will broken by corporate power, was buried in asylum ledgers and property deeds. The portrait is a masterpiece of narrative control, a weapon of soft power wielded with a photographer's scalpel and a mill owner's checkbook. We look at it and see 2 beautiful, doomed sisters in the woods. We are meant to see that. We are meant to feel a pang of romantic loss. But the real horror lies not in what the photograph shows, but in why it was made, to replace a brutal, mundane, and all too common truth with a more palatable, more poetic myth. It reminds us that history is often a gallery of such curated images, and that sometimes the most beautiful picture frames the ugliest secret. The sisters' empty, still faces are not gazing at a photographer in a forest. They are staring out from behind the bars of a fiction, imprisoned forever in a gorgeous, terrible lie.